We will start off where it first began, which is the origins of DNS security. So this is just a play that I hope you'll relate with, that just explains DNS security at a high level. Yeah. Of the
Oh, you have to go forward on here.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Now I can't multitask. It's a long way down and a long way around, so Ugwina and Og don't get to talk that much. So while they were sitting at a fire, they discovered smoke and they're like, okay, we can use smoke to communicate. So they start sending the messages through those smoke signals. And then comes this guy, he's a new guy, moves next door. He discovers that these two guys have been communicating through the smoke signal. So he joins the communication by also communicating through his smoke signal. And now this is confusing Ugwina on the other side. She doesn't know who's really sending what, because now there are two smoke signals that just look the same. Now these two are forced to request for help. They visit the wise men of the village, and this wise man discovers a solution for the two parties. He discovers that Og has blue sand in his cave that's only found in his cave. It's unique to his cave. So he quickly puts the sand, adds it to the fire, and then it turns the smoke signal blue. And this is that solution. Now, Ugwina knows who's sending the correct signal, because now the other smoke is blue, the other is not color-coded. So, and in basic terms, that's how DNS security operates. You and the person that you're communicating with have a key that's very unique to each other. It cannot be someone else's key. It belongs to you only and the partner that you're communicating with. So, yeah, DNS security allows us to publish records in the DNS with cryptographic signatures. I'd like to throw a question to the audience. Who knows the latest cryptographic algorithm that's been used for public keys? Anyone? Okay. It's the elliptic curve, the ECC. Yeah. That's the latest that's been used for public keys in the DNS security. So ideally, a signature gives us a way to tell whether data is authentic, just like what was happening in the play that we just had. We'll know that the data is coming from that particular person because we can authenticate to say, okay, we have this key that has been shared amongst people who are communicating or servers that are communicating. Then you would know which data is authentic. Perhaps I could also introduce the CIA model. I believe most of us know about it. When we talk of CIA, that's what we talk about. CIA standing for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So in essence, talks to make sure that the data that you're receiving has not been altered by anyone else up the sender of that message. So by having those DNSSEC keys amongst one another, you are able to say, okay, this message that I got, I'm going to authenticate and say it's from the original sender. An inaccurate signature can make real data look inauthentic. Yeah. So if you have real data and then you have a key that's maybe broken, which means the other party who has that same key won't be able to validate or authenticate if this key is real, then it would look like the data that's been sent is also unreal, because when you do the whole hash conversions and everything, it needs to give you the original value of that data that was sent. So if the key is broken and you have a proper message, you have high chances of saying that the message is not authentic, because the final result that you get from that conversion is not the desired result. Part of the layer defense against DNS spoofing. Spoofing is people who pretend to be who they are not. So when you use DNS security, like I've been explaining, if someone else you are communicating with sends a message and it's not from the originator, then you would know, because you cannot authenticate that data when it arrives to your server or computer. It can make denial of service attacks worse. Yeah. DNS traffic, most of it is like a UDP packet. So if now you're sending something that's with a bigger size, it means that some of the packets will be lost or dropped. I think from now, I'll just give over my colleagues to talk about the other latest technologies that are alternatives to the DNS security. But before that, yeah, sorry. I just want to say that as BOCRA, the registry operator, we have implemented DNS security. We use a software called Open DNS Security. Yeah, it's a resource, yeah, open source. That's the correct word. Yeah, over to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should I continue? I have the slides here. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yep. And I will say that Botswana is one of the few CCTLDs in Africa who have deployed DNSSEC. So we are in a place of more security conscious administration today than we could be in other parts of Africa. So this is DNSSEC, a very nice overview of DNSSEC. And DNSSEC is all about, as a publisher of DNS information, how do I attach signatures to the data so that people who receive the responses from the DNS can tell that it's authentic, that it hasn't been interfered with by somebody else. Some of the names in that cartoon are telling. Sure. And he is one of the people who first noticed that it is much easier to pollute and pollute DNS resolver caches and to send spoofed responses that could lead an unwary user to a bad site that might steal their bank details and cause some of the security problems we saw on the first slide. Dan Kaminsky was one of the people that caused the US government, for example, Department of Commerce, to actually deploy DNSSEC in the root zone. So what other security problems do we have? We don't just have that problem. We don't just have the problem of how do we make sure data is authentic. We also have other problems. Denial of service is something that we've mentioned at the bottom of this slide, the idea of... I realize that, but this slide is not here. So this slide has been replaced. Oh, it's all right, I have it under control. Is it on the next slide? No, it's not. It's gone on the slide deck. Anyway, so the other big problem that we have today, this is a very hot topic, is the idea of end user privacy. Because you can detect and predict an end user's activity to some degree of accuracy by watching the DNS lookups they make, because every application, every web page you go to triggers more lookups in the DNS. If you can see these lookups, then you can interpret what the end user is doing. And in some cases, you can control what the end user is doing. So we have examples for this, and we'll come down to them, but then some of them are close to home, some of them are larger. So as a response to this, these are some buzzwords that you should understand, and we'll use these in the conversation that we hope to have this morning. So DOT, who's heard of DOT? People in ICANN circles might have heard of DOT and DOH and know that these things are controversial, but perhaps we don't know exactly what they are. So DOT is DNS over TLS, and TLS is a protocol that we use every day when we browse the web. It's something that's integral to HTTPS. When you see the little lock in your browser that says that your access to a web page is secure, that means that the content is being encrypted with this thing called TLS, which stands for Transport Layer Security. And so this is relatively new. DOT has been standardized within, I think, the last 12 months, 24 months, and in the IETF. And the idea here is that when I send a query, which today and previously has been in plain text, if I send it over the network here, it's sent in plain text, people can see what I'm doing. DOT says we'll send it over an encrypted channel. We can tell that that channel is being used, but we can't necessarily tell what's happening inside that channel. So our queries, the nature of our queries is obscured to anybody who's looking over our shoulder. So we can't, the surveillance that might happen and the idea of watching what we're doing is obscured, and we have some degree of privacy. And this is DNS over TLS. The other buzzword that you might hear, and this is more controversial, is this idea of DOH, which uses exactly HTTPS as you use in your browser to carry DNS messages. And the interesting thing about this is that you can't tell from looking at it from the outside whether the HTTPS is carrying DNS messages or whether it's carrying normal contents of a web page. It could be carrying pictures of cats and movies and things like that, or it could be DNS messages, and you can't tell between them. And the reason this is interesting is that there are some places where there is a desire to change or watch what people are doing with the DNS. And DOH makes that very difficult because you can't tell. If you block all DOH, you're blocking all HTTP, really, in 2019, because so many pages are encrypted. So as we look further around the landscape of DNS security, we can't ignore the fact that we live in a world with registries and registrars. And while it might be tempting to think, how can I break someone's security by looking at the protocols that are involved in doing a DNS lookup, much easier than that sometimes is to imagine that everybody's passwords are weak. And I can just go into my registrar account. I can predict who they use. I can go change their domains. I can go point them somewhere else. I don't have to attack any of the protocols that are involved in the DNS lookups. I can just go in and do password hijacking and hijack a domain. So this is another important area not to overlook. And in fact, it's again, if you're active or paying attention to some of the recent controversies in ICANN circles, this is one of them. There are some very high-profile, significant operators of critical infrastructure on the internet who recently have been subject to these kinds of attacks. And so it doesn't matter how good your engineers are, there are always opportunities for someone to attack you. And the other thing to remember with this, it's not just the accounts that you use at your registrar. It could be the accounts you use at your email provider. The account you use to log into Yahoo or to Gmail in order for your email are places where you can retrieve a password by recover my password. Email me a token so that I can change my password. And these are also ways where you can affect these. You can subvert domains. Denial of service attacks. You may remember I was actually working at Dyn, which is a big email enterprise DNS provider in the US in 2016, I think it was, when I got woken up by a lot of messages on my phone. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. I didn't really want to wake up. But finally, I looked at my phone and I saw somebody from my group saying, really, you should pay attention to what's going on. And it was the time when Dyn was being attacked with big denial of service attacks. And it took out Twitter and Facebook and Amazon and Pinterest and everybody. And it was a terrible day. and the FBI came to the office and sat there until we fixed it, and it was not good. And but denial of service attacks are a fact of life, and applications, like Firefox, for example, and we turn on the option to use DNS over HTTPS, no ISP in the UK has any access to that DNS stream, and suddenly that blocking is broken. So there's an impact here that affects the national regulations in the environment where internet access is provided. And so this is an issue. And this has, in fact, come up in the House of Lords in the UK, where they've said, who is this obscure group of technical idiots who are messing with our laws? And this caused a great deal of hilarity in the IETF, because they know they're idiots, but they don't like people pointing it out. So just to summarize, we talk about DNS security, and because we're in the business we are, and because of the amount of effort that's put into it, we think to ourselves that what that means is DNSSEC. But DNSSEC is just part of the security landscape. It's not the whole story. And we have these new things that encrypt DNS to provide end-user privacy, and we have examples of very, very bad password hygiene with a variety of registrars and registries. Surely not the registrars and registries we have represented here at the table, which of course are glorious. But there was work to do all around to try and make this stuff more secure. So there we go. So we are now at the end of our slides. That is our introduction to DNS security. So the rest of the session, we hope we can use as a more interactive conversation between the room and the few of us up here at the front, where we pretend to know what we're doing and you pretend to have questions. So do we have any questions about DNS security?
Thank you very much, Joe. No, agenda ID signals and DNS security. So I think before we open, one question to Michele from Blacknight. So Blacknight is a hosting company. Maybe in about 5 minutes, could you, or 5 minutes or less, could you just tell us in terms of a hosting company, what you guys do for DNS security and what type of implementations you have?
Okay. Morning, everybody. It's early. So Joe and I were talking a bit before in the run up to this event about what areas we wanted to talk about and what things we wanted to raise. And I think the slides Joe went through, I think, covered quite a bit of that. So we run a reasonably large network. I mean, not it's reasonably large, not gigantic. And so we would have turned on various things like the validation on resolvers. We also would have, in recent months, enabled things like two-factor authentication for users. But I suppose the real thing that I suppose we would focus on more when it comes to those higher value clients is looking at the kind of more holistic approach, as in who has access to what. There's no point in using two-factor authentication, complex passwords, and all these other things if you're giving access to your super important data, your important domain names. If you're letting the intern who's in the office for a week, who you've never met before in your life and you don't know anything about, you're giving them access to everything. That is not a good idea. But the problem, though, is that not all of our users are very technical. They're not. They use the services that we provide for their businesses, and I spoke a little bit about this yesterday. And until there's a problem, they probably don't care. They're not going to worry about the security. So, for example, years ago, before we started enforcing password complexity, we used to have a situation where some of them would take the easy path when they were setting up email for their users. So if you had 5 employees, the 5th employee's password would end in 5. because they probably have come up with something like my strong password 1, my strong password 2, my strong password 3, where a strong password probably wasn't even that strong to begin with. So the problem, I suppose, is this challenge, which I think Joe did touch on a little bit, is trying to balance making things accessible so that people can use them, so they can use the technology, whilst also making them as secure as they're comfortable with. So let's say, taking your house, for example, your apartment. You obviously have a lock on the front door. I assume there's most of you do. You all have locks on your front door? Yes? No? Maybe? You all just leave your front door open. Okay, interesting. I'll take addresses later. So you put a lock on the front door. Maybe you might put in, you might have locks on the windows, but it's warm at night. You want to open the window so you can let some air in. If you have to spend 10 minutes looking for the key to open the window so you can get some air into your bedroom, then it's not convenient anymore. And this is the kind of challenge I see with some of these technologies. We enable two-factor authentication. You lose your mobile phone or you get a new phone, you have to change the two-factor authentication thing on the device. There's no easy way to move from one phone to another. In Joe's example, you changed your password last week, but you forgot to record it somewhere, either memorizing it or using some tool to record it. By the way, using a Post-it and putting it on your computer monitor, not a good idea. So I think these are the kind of challenges that we are struggling with internally when we're dealing with our clients, and also even with our own staff. For example, I think some of you who might be following security discussions recently will have seen blog posts, I think it was from Microsoft, talking about how forcing people to change their passwords regularly was probably a bad idea. As we've all been told for years, change your password regularly. And part of the reason for that is because if you force people to change their password too regularly, they end up writing it down on a Post-it and sticking it on their monitor because they can't remember it. Or they just make a minor change and you end up where, yes, it's secure, but not terribly. And I think this is the thing, is when you're looking at the DNS security as a whole, you need to just forget about DNSSEC. I mean, sorry, Joe, I know you love DNSSEC. There's no point having super duper DNSSEC and all these other funky technologies if you are letting some random employee who you don't really know or trust, if you're giving them full access to change all your DNS records. So it's like, oh yes, we've got DNSSEC, but Johnny's son who knows how to turn on a computer can change the DNS records. Oops, now our website's pointing somewhere completely different. I mean, but this is the kind of challenge, I suppose. That you need to look at the entire chain. Well, I've spoken for more than 5 minutes, so I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Michele. So I think we've covered the full scope of DNS security. So now we'd like to open for questions. I think we can take questions from the floor. Anyone who has a question? Yes. Please introduce yourself, then ask a question.
I'm from UB. I'm an academic, so one of the things that you mentioned was that DNSSEC can make DDoS attacks worse. I'm just trying to understand how, and then where would you choose something that would make something worse versus when we had spoofing? So it's better to increase denial of services than to continue with what we was doing?
So I think this is a good question. And the reason I mentioned this is because we need to emphasize that there isn't one solution to all security problems. Just because this is my earlier slide, that security is like a zoo, and you put two different kinds of animals in the same cage, one of them will eat the other one. Not all kinds of security are compatible. So the basic problem with DNS was that it was designed in an era where there was no spam, where there were no denial of service attacks, where it was just trusted academics who talked to each other across a sort of an open network with very little authentication. And there was no need for any of this stuff because it was so small and it wasn't significant enough for money to be involved, which then money is generally the origin of all crime. If there's no money involved, then there's no reason to do a crime. We're not in that world today in 2019. So the problems that we have with DNS that we've inherited from those early days are that it had no security built in, no authenticity protection, but also no origin protection. So the denial of service problems with DNS stem from the fact that if I send a message to a DNS server, generally I use this protocol called UDP, which is an interesting technical fact. But the interesting component of that, the consequence of that for security, is that there is no need to authenticate the sending address. So it's almost like I send a letter to somebody, but I put my return address as somebody that I want to receive a lot of return mail. I send lots of messages out, and I get all the free mail coming back. I send small letters out, and I get great big catalogs coming back. And the person whose return address I put down gets all these, every day they get like 500 kilograms of catalogs delivered to their house, which becomes a problem. Well, this is the problem we have with the DNS, with UDP. We don't, there's nothing in the protocol that requires the source address to be authentic. So I can send a query to a server, a small query, and get a response. But because I set my source address to be Angela's address and not my address, the response goes to her. And she didn't ask the question. So it's junk traffic for her. And I do that 100 million times per second from a legion of infected Windows machines across the country. And suddenly there's enough traffic there to knock her off the internet. And that's the denial of service. So that amplification effect, which is we're familiar with, anybody who runs an ISP understands that their outbound traffic is small and their return traffic is big, because outbound, I say, can I watch this TV show? And in return, I get a TV video signal, which is much larger. The DNS is no different. And DNSSEC, because it involves attaching signatures to responses, it makes that amplification worse. So the small request I send out now result in an even bigger response. So multiplying that by these 100 million infected Windows boxes makes it worse. So it makes denial of service attacks worse, but it solves the authentication problem. So this is like having the lion and the zebra in the same cage. They're different security problems, but one doesn't necessarily help the other.
I think so, just to add a little bit to this, because one of the problems when we talk about DNS security is a lot of people conflate DNS security and DNSSEC. It's like DNS security is the entire menu. There's a lot of little options, there's little switches you can turn on, there's decisions you can make. But there's been a lot of people pushing for DNSSEC adoption. And now you end up where some people think, oh, I've got DNSSEC, so I've now got security done. It's like saying, I've got a firewall, my network is now secure. Yay, well done. No, it's not. I mean, it's just because you have a firewall doesn't mean your network is secure. Just because you have DNSSEC doesn't mean you've solved that. And then for the technical thing, it's to do with it's the size of the packets of data. So to use and these are just completely incorrect numbers, but to kind of give you an idea, if a normal DNS response was, say, the size of my mobile phone, when you add the DNSSEC and everything else, it's now the size of a laptop. It's not quite that, but the idea is it becomes bigger. Now, as the ISP on the receiving side, if I've got firewalls, routers, switches, all these other things, the firewall, no matter how big the firewall is, it has to process the data. I'm going to go, okay, this is good traffic, this is bad traffic, this is traffic I'm not too sure what to do with. So you end up in a situation where it's trying to process all of this and make decisions and say, okay, this is a video of a cat. This is something trying to attack me. Which one's which? So it just adds to the complexity.
Yes. Another question?
Oh, no.
Okay. Wait, sorry, before you take a question, Angela had a small addition.
Yeah. What we can say is that those denial of service attacks will happen. So what can you do as an end user? You'd find that through the use of legacy systems that are not correctly patched, you become part of what you call botnets, where you have systems being controlled by an unknown user to target those DNS systems. So you could also play a role by, patching your systems, being up to date with the latest software, so that you don't contribute towards these denial of service attacks. And also we have intrusion detection systems on place to detect if there are such attacks. And if maybe those fail, you can also have redundancy in place to take over in case there's that type of denial of service to the DNS system. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Angela. I hope your question has been answered. So I saw a question here, then Abdelmonem, and any other question?
Yes.
Okay, maybe take those two, then we'll.
This is a remote question from Mark Elkins. What percentage of resolvers cannot yet use the elliptical curve, and how many are in Africa? That is, when will it be a good idea to use elliptical curve?
So elliptic curve is elliptic curve is a class of algorithms that are used to encrypt things, and the interesting component, the interesting aspect of elliptic curve algorithms, instead of things like RSA and DSA, as far as the DNS is concerned, is the signatures are smaller, because effectively the signature is a reference to a point on an ellipse of a particular kind of curve. And it doesn't have different security properties based on key sizes, which is a property that we have with RSA. To make RSA more secure, you need bigger keys. It's not the case with elliptic curve algorithms. So the question was, the original specification of DNSSEC didn't use elliptic curve algorithms. These have been added since. I mean, every time you add something to a protocol, it takes time for it to be deployed. You can't necessarily assume you can use it day one. You have to wait until a later time to give people a chance to upgrade it. I think there was some, the question is effectively, can you use elliptic curve algorithms to sign your DNS and reliably expect people to be able to validate those signatures? And I think the short answer is yes, you can do that. So as far as the details about which of these things in Africa, what's the proportion of validators in Africa that support elliptic curve algorithms, I don't have numbers to hand. But I do know that, for example, something like 80% of resolver traffic that we see at the .org name servers come from around about 20 different resolver systems in the world. And there are some that are very familiar, things like 8.8.8.8, Google Public DNS. That accounts for about 12% of all traffic we receive at .org from resolver systems. That's already a large proportion. 8.8.8.8 happens to be a validating resolver, and they happen to support elliptic curve. So there's already 12% there just in one. And our experience is that elliptic curve algorithms are safe to deploy in signing systems today, and you can largely expect them to be interpreted correctly. And for the small number of resolver systems that don't support elliptic curve, the failure mode is benign. It doesn't cause things to stop resolving. It just causes the validation function to become unavailable.
Okay. I think those are questions from Abdelmonem. Please introduce yourself and ask a question.
This is Abdelmonem Galila from Egypt. Actually, I have more than one question. The first question about, as I know that DNSSEC maintains the chain of trust starting from the resolver, ending by the resolver again. So the main goal behind DOH and DOT to secure the channel between me as a client and between the resolver. Yes. As you said, it depends on the browser. So all the browsers support these two new protocols. This is my first question. As I said earlier that it will be an encrypted channel between me as a client and the resolver. It will have any impact about the speed of the response of the messages come from the resolver to me. This is the second question. There's two new points, as this gentlewoman said, there is a new algorithm called elliptic curve. I don't think we will not be happy about the new algorithm. We will be happy about the increased size of the key. So, and this, if we increase the size of the key, it will impact the DNS response of DNSSEC. So it will be maybe dropped by firewall. So it's not a good idea. Also, if we update the operating system, if we update the DNS software, it doesn't mean for us that I will be prevented from DDoS attacks. DDoS attack depends on maybe I am here, I make a script to send to your DNS in a request and send the other response to for example, for Kevin. So it means that we should have another methodology to mitigate DDoS attacks like DNS, like something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdelmonem. So those are a number of questions. So the first one was for the browsers, how many of them have ability to do DOH and DOT? I know Mozilla has it. Maybe, I don't know, Joe, if you have more to add on that.
Chrome's adding it.
And cool.
So it's Mozilla Firefox, Chrome. I'm not sure if they've turned it on yet, but I know it's in the betas anyway. I don't know anything about Safari. I haven't heard anything about Safari. I don't know if Joe knows anything about that.
So I think the actual answer is that by default, there is no shipping mainstream browser today that does these things. You have to turn them on. There's a trial. I forget exactly what word it was used to describe it in Mozilla, but there was a
Trial head.
Okay, there was effectively a test where you can turn this on a particular non-production build of Firefox. I think you can turn it on perhaps in a production build by explicitly selecting it. Where you can turn on DOH in a partnership between Mozilla and Cloudflare. But the other thing to mention is not only is this not turned on by default in shipping browsers, but the protocols themselves are very immature. These things have been, the standardization process has really just started in the IETF. This week in Montreal, the IETF is meeting. There is what's called a BOF, which is a birds of a feather session. It's a precursor to a working group. So it's very early days. And they're just in there discussing the various aspects of applications like browsers doing DNS. I think this meeting is actually happening. It may actually be happening right now. I'm not sure. I think it's happening today. So we're very early stages of having this stuff even being standardized and written down how it should work, never mind having it implemented. So DOH and DOT are interesting. And the reason you've perhaps heard of them is because they do impact the real world that we live in. They impact the ability of governments to block and control DNS traffic. They impact the costs of an enterprise who want to be able to manage the DNS traffic inside their corporate network. So these are the threats on the landscape from those perspectives. And of course, there are corresponding opportunities for end users who can enjoy privacy that they haven't previously enjoyed. So this is why it's controversial, but it's not shipping technology today.
I believe Alice of Mozilla wants to answer something.
Yeah. My name is Alice Munoz. I work with Mozilla, but I'm not a techie, so please don't ask me technical questions. But I can, confidently say that Mozilla launched on June 4th what we're calling enhanced tracking protection. So any Firefox user that downloads Firefox right now, you have, track by default, privacy or protection by default. So we're already doing that at the moment as a tester. So that's why we're calling it trial head. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Second question was in relation to speed, whether DOT, DOH will impact the speed on browsing when we enable that on our browsers. Angela or Michele, you want to take that?
Yeah. I've spoken to a couple of people about this over the last couple of months. And I suppose the answer is possibly. But the other thing is, I'm not sure. Nobody said to me, oh my God, this is going to slow it down massively. So I don't know, unless Joe has or somebody has some insights into that. I don't think it's going to It will add an overhead, but I'm not sure if it's significant.
Yeah, I just want to say I worked on a project as part of the hackathon in the recent African Internet Summit meeting, and we did test Cloudsphere, that's the Quad4 resolver, against the REAP Atlas to measure that, and it's not really significant that speed that's reduced. Yeah, it's not really that much. It was just a difference of seconds. Yeah, but there is of course a concern that maybe it's not really working for Africa. We have to, the Cloudflare, we have to maybe have our own developed resolvers that can answer these queries and maximize the time of response using the root service. Yes.
So what Angela is saying is very, very important, because from the test they did at the hackathon, which I was there as well, when a query was made to a server that was in Europe, there was a certain speed, but when the query was done against a server that's in Africa, it was much faster. So the message here is, we need to deploy a lot of these infrastructures in the region so that the response time can be better and can be faster. Yeah. That's what you're trying to say.
I think that's the perfect way of answering it. There are far more things that affect the speed of an end user's experience than the protocol that you use to encapsulate your DNS message. But just as a science experiment, just in the lab, because it's, like I said, it's not widely deployed, it does seem that there's enough engineering that has gone into optimizing HTTPS and TLS, and enough sort of product and vendor space has been dedicated to this that we don't expect a massive overhead. You would expect things being encrypted to be slower because it takes time to do the encryption and the decryption. But in fact, there's enough hardware and software effort that's gone into making this stuff fast for other reasons, just for the web, that we don't expect to see a great deal of overhead. There'll still be some, but it's in practical terms, it's not much. And as Angela said, particularly in Africa, the access to centralized resolvers, which might be hosted in other countries and far away, is a far bigger effect on the speed at which things can be resolved.
I think for Abdelmonem's last question, it was more what do the changes in the technologies mean for firewalls and devices we use in between? I don't know who wants to take that one in terms of the changes of all these protocols we're seeing coming out of the ITF and everything. The servers we're running, the firewalls we're running, what does all these changes mean? Maybe Blacknight, would you answer that?
Sure. Well, okay, I'm not going to get into the particular ciphers and all that. That's something that people like Joe get all excited about and can talk about at length. I think there's an area here with this which I think we have touched on, but we haven't really dived into more deeply. And I think this is the one where the room ends up divided. So DOT uses a specific port. I mean, the traffic is going in a particular way, so you can. It's something special that's happening. So I suppose what you could do is, technically speaking, and somebody can correct me, you could just kind of block it so that it couldn't happen. But with DOH, it's piggybacking on the HTTPS traffic. So HTTPS is good. We all agree about this. It's like, everything's secure. You want to go and buy something online, you look for the padlock. We've been training people to do that for years. Of course, the browsers started making that harder, which impacts my SSL sales. Stop doing that. But HTTPS is everywhere. And this is something Joe mentioned earlier, that if as it's piggybacking on the HTTPS, you get greater user privacy, yay. It also means you also have the impact that you're reducing user security. So with the firewalls and the other tools that you deploy, both on like in a small network just in your office, or in a larger network as at the level of the ISP, if you're no longer able to say for example, algorithmically generated domains, which are used for all sorts of charming, nefarious activities like lovely phishing attacks and things like that. So the CCTLDs working together kind of go, right, here's a list of names that should not resolve. They should not exist on the internet. So you're able to block them in some way. But if it's all the traffic is now going through HTTPS, you can know, as the ISP or the person running that network, you've now suddenly lost the ability to do that. So you have to weigh this up. Joe talks about the UK being an oppressive regime. And why? I mean, he's saying that ISPs in the UK have to block certain domain names. Ireland, I wouldn't consider to be that oppressive, but several of the ISPs have signed agreements with some of the big rights holders, I mean, basically movie studios and music companies, and are now blocking specific domain names because of the distribution of copyright material. And it's this side of it that I think is where there is going to be some interesting debates. I mean, how do you allow the user to have more privacy, but allow me as the network operator to still control my network? Do I have a duty of care to my user? So as an employer, I know I do. As an employer, I have to make sure that my company network in the office is safe and secure. As an ISP, should I be stopping those infected machines from spewing stuff onto the internet? And I think this is where this aspect of it, it's not the technology, it's the deployment that's kind of problematic.
Thanks, Michele. Any other questions from the floor? There's a question at the back. One. Anyone else with a question? Okay, we'll take that question. Please introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Hi, my name is John Foley from Bytes Technology Group. I'd like to get a response from the panel as to my interpretation of what's actually going on here. DNSSEC is a technology which is providing security in certain respects. It's providing us authenticity so that we know that we're talking to the domain we thought we were talking to. And it's very good at doing that. And it's actually very, very powerful. And it's a very robust system in that sense. And then we say, well, the trouble is we've got another problem with DNS, which is that stuff is being sent in clear text. So we've got a privacy issue. Let's fix the privacy issue. How are we going to fix the privacy issue? Well, we're actually going to have Mozilla, which normally is an application running on your phone or your desktop. You browse, and the request goes out to a DNS server somewhere under your control, and you get a response. And now we're going to say, instead of Mozilla and Google just being apps that you use to browse the net, they're actually going to be a service which is actually going to have control of your DNS requests. And they're going to be a single source of knowledge, of data, as to what you're doing. So now your privacy, we're trying to increase our privacy, we've actually completely destroyed it, because now a few organizations are going to have all that information about us. Where's it being stored? What country is it in? Who's got access to it? I don't know. Thank you.
So I certainly I certainly wouldn't present myself as speaking authoritatively for Mozilla. And we have, of course, very lucky to have Alice in the room who can do that. But the point you make is interesting. And again, this speaks to these central conflicts between different kinds of security. So we have authenticity, which, as you correctly sort of observed, is something that DNSSEC sort of approaches. We have DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, which by themselves are privacy-enhancing technologies. We also have centralization of the resolver function, which I think is clear, is not, you don't centralize services in order to make them more secure, because in that case, as you again pointed out, you're centralizing the opportunity for surveillance and control of those DNS responses. So these things are all in tension. A couple of things though. First of all, Mozilla is not the first application. Firefox is not the first application to make DNS choices for the user that might well be different from the choices that are made by the network administrator to which the user is connecting. So two examples are Chromecast devices that you can use in order to project TV onto your smart, video streams onto your smart television. Those have used 8.8.8.8 for a long time, which, as I understand it, is a pragmatic choice because you reduce your support costs if you're Google by using a DNS resolver service that tends to be more reliable than your local ISP, which on the average, from Google's experience, is true. And I don't think that's necessarily an outlandish suggestion. The other one is Netflix, that I think did that for a very similar reason. Netflix applications have been using their own DNS servers rather than the network supplied ones for a long time. So what Firefox is doing is not new, but they've tried to mitigate the centralization problems which would normally act against the idea of end user privacy by putting very strict requirements on the providers that the browser will use. So they've, again, only according to the public statements, I have no private knowledge, but they have an agreement with Cloudflare that no end user personal identifying information will be retained, that any data at all will be deleted, I think, after 24 hours, and they knowing some of the engineers there, they exceed that limitation. They actually delete all their stuff within about 12 hours. They only use it in aggregate for traffic engineering purposes. So I think Mozilla has done their best to do due diligence here and put requirements on the kinds of centralized services that they use. There's currently only one. It's not on by default. And they have an active program which they've been very public about the kinds of constraints they would put on other providers in a similar vein. So I think it's reasonable to say that all of this is a Band-Aid on something that is not necessarily acting in the interest of the user, but it's a balancing act. And I think the engineers at Mozilla that I've talked to about this see their responsibility to the privacy of the end user, and they are not interested in accommodating the requirements of, for example, corporate network administrators or governments. They are very clear. Far clearer than the rest of this muddy situation, to be honest, and saying exactly where their alliances lie, and they've made a compromise that they believe is in the best interest of the end user. So I think it's a centralization of services. I think I absolutely agree. It's not the ideal situation if you want to maintain end user privacy. Ideally, you want, if you've got 100,000 users, you want 100,000 different points where you can tap the traffic rather than one, because 100,000 points are harder to tap than 1 point. But there aren't 100,000 points where you can guarantee that the privacy exists. And there's only there's a scaling problem there for an application to try and make those kinds of decisions. So I think it's a pragmatic choice.
Thank you, Joe. I think Michele has something to add, and then probably ask a question to Angela, because I know you also deployed DOT, DOH. How long did it take you to deploy such a server? But let's hear from Michele, then we'll continue.
Yes, John and I were discussing this briefly yesterday as well. And I do sort of agree with what Joe's been saying, but at the same time, as an operator, I do worry about this a bit because giving away that control is a bit scary. So at a recent event that both of us were attending, some people were just saying, look, if you're worried about the centralization thing, which I think is a valid concern, the simple solution is deploy your own. Deploy your own, turn it on your own resolvers, so that, because the way that some of the browsers are implemented is at the moment, and again, this is an implementation, it's not the actual protocol, the actual RFCs and the technology, it's just a couple of applications have gone down this route. My understanding, I think it's with Chrome in particular, I can't speak to Mozilla since I haven't used it in years, no offense, just got so bloated. The way that I think Chrome is meant to be doing it is that if you try to turn on DOH, it'll check and see if the resolver it's already using supports it, and if it doesn't, then it goes to the external one. So if you provide something on your network that solves the problem, as it were, then you don't have the issue of it going somewhere else. But, and this is the bit that I'm sorry, let's call a spade a spade. Cloudflare, Google, all these companies, they love to tell us all how they're doing all these things for the betterment of the world and how are these warm and cuddly and fuzzy. But all these companies are publicly traded. Now, what does that mean in real terms? They have shareholders. What do shareholders care about? Money. Yes. So if you turn around to a company and you go, hey, you've got this massive resource over here, but you're not monetizing it, and I want return on my investment, what's going to happen? I mean, it's this kind of thing. I mean, if you remember years ago, Google used to say, what was it, do no harm or something like that. They had, don't be evil, that was it, sorry. Did you notice that they dropped that? That kind of disappeared a couple of years ago, kind of quietly. It just vanished. And then it's no longer Google, it's now, what's it, ABC or XY, Alphabet or something like that. So the thing is, you have to be careful with that, because that's one thing. And the other thing is, at the moment, those two big deployments are in one jurisdiction. So they are going to be subject to one set of courts. So it doesn't matter how much the engineers might say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. If you are served with some kind of court order, you can't fight them indefinitely. So I think part of the thing you all need to look at is deploying your own solution.
I think on that, I think it's an important point, deploying your own solution. Angela, I know you have hands-on experience with DOT, DOH. Could you tell us roughly how long it took you to set up? What are there any challenges? Is it complicated, or is it something anyone can do?
The DOH server?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it was a marathon, took us a day. We were given 2 days to build the server and test it using the repartless. So we were in a team of 4. Yeah. It took us, roughly 8 hours to do the configurations for both servers, actually, the DOH and the DOT. So if you really know what you're doing, it won't take much of your time to do that, including even testing everything, observing the traffic, if it's resolving and all those things. It doesn't take much time. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. I think Barak had a question from the remote users. Is that the case, Barak? And I see 2 more questions, one at the back. So we'll start with the remote one, then the gentleman at the back, and the gentleman.
Thank you, moderator. We have a remote question from Shah Rahman from Bangladesh. He's asking, what is DNS spoofing and how can we prevent DNS spoofing?
So DNS spoofing is not really specific to the DNS. It's specific to protocols where you don't have a good way of authenticating the source of a query. So you receive a query that purports to be from a particular source, you send a response to that address, but you have no way of telling whether that address is a legitimate source or whether it's a victim that might be receiving the traffic, which amounts to unwanted traffic. So the way that you solve this in the DNS, there are some ways to try and prioritize or to try and reduce the effect of DNS servers as amplifiers. The things like response rate limiting, which you can turn on, which are quite effective. But really the better solution is to avoid the transport protocols that allow spoofing to exist, and instead to use things where the source address is known to be authentic. So the way you do this in the DNS today is you can use TCP as a transport instead of UDP. This is somewhat complicated in some platforms to configure by default, because using the existing transports, UDP is the preferred because it's less overhead. All these new protocols, DOH, DOT, and also DNS over QUIC being a Google transport protocol that is carried on UDP but contains some sort of source address verification, are ways of mitigating that. So you can't really avoid it with DNS over UDP, but you can choose different transport protocols. So between the end user and the resolver, DOH and DOT are solutions. And there are few good solutions that have been standardized between the resolver and the authoritative server. There are some conversations that have started, but it's early days.
Okay, I think there's a question at the back and then here. So maybe the gentleman at the back first, then Bob. Please introduce yourself. Oh, maybe you could walk to a mic. Can't hear you. I think one of the front tables has mics. Yeah.
He's not behind the field. Behind the issue.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry for the time we're still on this. I just want to say that there's alternatives for the recursive servers that protect privacy and customers' data. For example, Quad 9 has been developed by PCH for this specific purpose, and it's a non-profit initiative. There's no commercial benefits behind this, not like the other alternatives currently we have, Google and Cloudflare. So if you start using Quad 9 and if you go to quad9.net and start using 9.9.9, there's no information will be stored. Everything is, we also block malware and phishing sites based on a partnership with about 15 threat intelligence providers. So there's options there from the nonprofit community trying to resolve issues. This one angle. The other thing is, as a question to Joe, we have seen the number of attacks on DNS from state actors increase recently. And so what's your advice to registries in Africa? And did you see any patterns of politically motivated attacks on CCTLD registries happening recently? Thank you.
So there are different kinds of attacks that we could talk about. And really what's an attack and what is implementation of policy depends on your perspective. But I suspect that what you're talking about, particularly in combination with PCH's infrastructure in Quad 9, is the idea that there were state actors who have put their resources to bear on infrastructure and companies that are based outside of their borders. And this is not an attack on their citizens, as you might imagine could be an interpretation of how you enforce regulation, but rather it's more like an international military action against infrastructure that's hosted elsewhere.
So Bill Woodcock did quite a sort of an open presentation, as you would expect from PCH, who are very community-minded and are very open with their infrastructural issues when they happen. And he talked about this in the ICANN DNS symposium in Bangkok. And I think he's talked about it in other venues as well. The problem that PCH had was not even due to a lack of security in their own network. It was a lack of security in somebody else's network. So they were using a combination of resellers and registrars to host the domain name pch.net, which is the domain name used to name a lot of their infrastructure. And one of the resellers of a registrar of a registry had a credential problem where these state actors were able to determine the passwords and then change the name servers for pch.net to different servers and then capture the traffic for a short period of time, long enough to be able to do things like capture email credentials and to mine email boxes and then gain more credentials and get more access. So I think this is one of the things I was getting at when I was saying that DNS security is not just DNSSEC. PCH had DNSSEC deployed. I mean, there was some aspect of the attack that made it easier to detect because they were using DNSSEC. But there was no vulnerability here that fundamentally DNSSEC would protect against. The problem here was bad password security, and not even in PCH's employees or in their network, but in another network. Because there are other people that are involved through the registry chain that can impact the stability of a DNS name other than the people who are the registrants. So this is a very good example, I think, of the fact that you need a wider perspective on security than just DNSSEC. You need to understand that every link in the chain could be a potential vulnerability, and you cannot depend on the fact that your domain name is well hosted or well registered as you expect it, because it might be changed without your knowledge, and that could effectively introduce an external threat into your own security. So it's a good opportunity to say that congratulations to PCH on dealing with the impact of the attack as efficiently as they did, and also for speaking about it in public, because I think it gives an excellent reminder to everybody who relies on domain names that
the domain names are only as secure as the companies that are used to register them and serve them.
Thanks, Joe. I think Bob had a question. Introduce yourself and then ask.
Thanks, Kevin. I just wanted to maybe also get Joe's opinion on assuming I'm on the other side of the debate, maybe law enforcement or government, and I'm asking myself, what does this mean for me from an investigatory perspective? If this is deployed, to what extent can law enforcement still, do their work around DNS abuse and misuse and such instances? And maybe the other question that maybe you could also respond to is, there is, advice that DNSSEC should be deployed. Are we saying the same for DOH and DOT? Is it the same approach that we are advising operators that this is good technology? I understand the standard is really just starting to be developed. But are we looking at a situation where we would be advising that this is the way to go? This is part of the security implementations that would be good for your system. Thank you.
These are very good questions, and you can tell they're good questions because they don't have easy answers. So we'll start from the beginning. You talked about law enforcement, and this is not my area. I'm not an expert in how law enforcement uses the DNS in order to track malware and to the partnerships that they have with registries for takedowns and abuse handling. My impression, though, is that little of that depends upon being able to monitor the DNS between an end user and the resolver. Most of that is effectively put into use by other means of detecting abuse, and then monitoring the traffic through a process of takedowns, redelegations through registries, and perhaps shifting DNS traffic towards authoritative servers that are controlled by partners of law enforcement. So I don't think the DOH and DOT have a great deal of threat to that existing working model. I think most of that will continue as it is, and I don't think DOH or DOT has much of an impact. However, there is another realm of regulatory access or regulatory control over the DNS that will be affected by this, and that is the thing we've mentioned a couple of times, the idea of whichever level you do it. It could be a house with a parent trying to control access by their children, or it could be a company trying to control the access of their employees, or it could be a country working through ISPs to control what's accessible by the people who are within that country. And all of these things have an impact, not because of the protocols in particular, but because of the use of centralized DNS services that are outside those policy regimes in combination with the encryption. So if I'm not using a resolver inside the house and I'm a child, or I'm not using a resolver inside the corporation and I'm an employee, or I'm not using a resolver inside the country and I'm a citizen within a realm of regulation, I'm using something outside. And if my interaction with that outside service is encrypted and can't be intercepted and can't be changed, then that is a way of avoiding the policy regime that I'm sitting in. So the easiest way, I think, to think about this is not to have the complicated discussion about governments and what policies make sense for governments to impose, but to imagine children. We can all agree that there are some things that children, we would prefer for our own children not to see on the internet. There are many things on the internet that are unpleasant material, regardless of your opinions or religion or anything else. That they are unpleasant things, and you perhaps prefer your children not to look at them. So as a parent, you might say, I would prefer my children not to look at those things. It's not just the internet. It could be books, it could be magazines, it could be TV shows, it could be movies, it could be all kinds of things. But these days, overwhelmingly, it is things on the internet. So if we imagine that there is a situation where every one of us could imagine, I would prefer my child not to be able to see that thing, then that is an example of policy that could be circumvented by a child using a browser that can use an external service that is not subject to those limits. And the fact that this exists and is an attractive option for parents is demonstrated by the number of services that a parent could buy and incorporate into their home network if they wanted to do this. So I'm actually an exception to this rule because my children have always had a completely unfiltered access to the internet because I trust them to make good decisions. And I trust that they will be sufficiently frightened by the first bad thing they see that they won't go and look at it again. And it seems to have worked for my children, but not all children are the same. So the last question I think is we recommend that people deploy DNSSEC, but do we necessarily recommend that people deploy these things? And that is really the complicated question. The downside of DNSSEC is really simply the complexity of deploying it, which might cause problems that otherwise wouldn't exist, together with the opportunity to make the denial of service attack problem worse. But those things are kind of under the control of the people who deploy DNSSEC. You can decide not to deploy it and you can avoid the complexity. You can decide not to deploy it and you can avoid the DNS, the denial of service approaches, and they're kind of all concentrated in that same decision point. It's not the case with DOH and DOT. The decision to deploy those things depends not even necessarily on the end user, because the end user might just be ill-informed. The first time Chrome or Firefox ship with these things turned on by default, the end users will use them. And they haven't necessarily made an informed decision, but they're using them anyway. So in this case, the impact, the lack of control is distant from the corresponding tension, which is the right to privacy. And the end user that's making this decision is not necessarily even aware that they're making it. So it's much more complicated. I think in this case, we will see DOH and DOT being deployed without end users making any kind of decision. And it will be down to the application implementers, the people who make the software that are really making this decision. And this, I think, is the fundamental interesting component of DOH and DOT. We're taking a situation where the network administrator decides how you look up names, and we're shifting that to the people who ship software, which might have no relationship with the network operator at all. In general, they wouldn't. So that is the fundamental shift, I think, that we're talking about in terms of policy with resolution.
Thanks, Joe. Michele, Angela, would you want to add to that? We can take, I think we can take probably the final round of questions that we can allow for wrap up. Angela, you have something to add?
Yeah, I think he's already mentioned so much. It just says to the end user, like he's just said, who do you trust at the end of the day? Is it your root systems or your resolver? So if you can make that decision, then you'll really know what to go with. And he did mention infrastructure. If you don't have the infrastructure to develop DNSSEC, it will be messy and you'll end up maybe not even able to use the internet. So it's really critical to make those underlying decisions before you implement either of the security. Yeah.
And I know you said it would take you 8 hours. I know that was a lab environment, but second time round, like if you have the infrastructure ready, servers and everything, how long do you think it will take you to deploy a DOH server now that you deployed it the first time?
Honestly.
Your employer is listening.
For those who may be interested in deploying.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I understand, according to the team that was leading us, that's not all that you need to deploy DOT and DOH. There's still some levels of maybe security or any other mechanisms that will mitigate what we're talking about earlier on the delay in response and all those things. But the basis of having that resolver running, but even an hour could do, honestly, because
Great. So about an hour to get this one. I think that's a good answer. I think a final round of questions. Okay, so Abdulmonem, anyone else with a question, or is there a remote question? Barak, maybe you can tell us. Is there any remote question? So, sorry? Not at the moment. So, Abdulmonem, I think you can just.
Thank you, Barak. This is Abdulmonem again. My question to Joe and Michael about that, are there any policy or any rules that controls the gap between the privacy, my right to privacy, and the right to control from the government or other entity? Is the first question. As I know that public DNS provider or operator have the benefits from buying statistics to other entities. It's already happened. But for now, if I use DOH or DOT, so what's the benefits will be gained by the public DNS providers? Thank you.
Michele, you can start.
Sure. Okay, so privacy versus government. What was an interesting one? So I think this probably comes down to, in some respects, was where you live or where you are, not necessarily where you live. In that, in some parts of the world, that balance has been sort of found. I don't think it's perfect anywhere. I think there's challenges pretty much everywhere. But I think in other parts of the world, it's very clear that the government just doesn't care about the privacy and will just make its top-down decision. I mean, Joe might say that the UK is that way. I think that's being a little bit extreme. I'm thinking more along the lines of countries where I can't browse the internet normally, that every second website I try to go to is blocked because of some bizarre reason that some government agency has decided that this is obviously far too dangerous for me. I think though the real thing though is it's really down to you personally. I mean, if you value your privacy and you want to be able to browse the internet securely and privately, you're probably going to find a way to do that. And I mean, in some countries, there's talk now in the last few months about, I think it was in Russia, there was there's talk about how they're trying to block certain VPN providers and from being available to Russian users. But there's nothing to stop a technically competent person from building their own VPN solution if you feel that strongly about it. But there's no simple answer to that. And I don't think there is no kind of global policy. There's no global law. I mean, if you take, say, the UN statement on human rights or whatever the thing's called, I've got the name wrong. I mean, a lot of countries sign up for it in principle, but do they actually follow it through? And you probably find that many of them don't. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
I think this seems like a complicated topic, mainly because we forget that security is a complicated topic. There is no good security and there's no bad security. There's risk analysis, and there are decisions that you make according to the risk profile that you think is relevant to you or to your company or to your country. There is no absolute security. There is no absolute privacy. So some examples here are, even on the end user perspective, we might present this as being, external agents like parents, employers, governments versus the end user. But that's not as simple as that statement makes it sound like. As an end user, sometimes you don't want privacy. Sometimes if I'm going to use the internet and I'm going to have people advertising at me, I would rather them advertise things that I'm actually interested in than advertise things that I'm not interested in. That makes my experience better. It saves me looking for where I buy something. If someone advertises something that's good that I want, the first time I go onto the internet, that's actually kind of good. There are many things that, I have an iPad here, which I have some confidence is more secure than perhaps if I was using a different kind of laptop. But there are many people who are not technical users who are unaware that the main user of their laptop is not them. It's a botnet that's coordinated through a Ukrainian agency that they've never heard of because they've got malware installed on their laptop, and that malware is doing things on the internet that they're not even aware of at all. It's sending spam, they're launching denial of service attacks. So these are all things where as an end user, you might want to have somebody, an agency or an employer or a parent block these kinds of things in the DNS or elsewhere, because those things ultimately are not things that you want. So I think the answer will always be complicated because security is complicated. I mean, the perfect security for your house is to not have any doors and windows, because that way nobody can get in, but it also means you can't get out. So it's not very practical.
Thanks, Joe. I think we have time for one last question. Is anyone from the floor with a question? Okay, I don't see any questions. So I think we can start with the wrap up. I have probably just one question for all the panelists. We've mentioned a lot. We've mentioned a lot of terminologies, DNSSEC, DOT, DOH, and the landscape seems to be evolving a lot. There's always some new way to secure your DNS or your infrastructure. For someone who's an end user, what does all this mean for them? Like, if I'm just a normal internet user who just wants to browse normally, what do all these terminologies mean? For example, let me ask you, Michele, for your customers, what do all these things mean for them? If, as a service provider, do you need to advise your customers, like, this thing has come out, you need to keep an eye on it, or we'll do this for you? What do all these changes mean for you as a provider, and how does it impact the internet user at home?
Okay, thanks. So I suppose first off, I'd have to kind of split that user thing into two groups, because there's the user who's my mother, for example. She might be a little atypical, but she doesn't really go off and register domain names or set up websites or do these kind of things. And then there's our customers who are registering domains, setting up online things, selling services, buying services, and doing those other things. And they're two distinct groups. So the one group, which includes just pretty much anybody who touches the internet, I think we all have to do the best we can to help them and to educate them to look for what I would refer to as, trust signals. So what I mean by that is, if you're going to if you see an advert on Facebook or in an app or something like that, and it's saying to you, you can buy this super duper product, it's going to solve some insolvable problem, but it's going to make your life better. When you go to that website, what are you looking for to make sure that the website is genuine, and that if you pay money for the product, that you're actually going to receive the product? Whether the product actually solves the problem or not, another conversation. But you're training people to kind of think, look, is there an SSL certificate? Is there, if I go to the contact page, there might actually be a physical address, a proper telephone number. There might even be a photograph or two of an employee. I mean, just something that makes you feel, hey, this is a real company. But then when it comes to our own clients, it's an interesting balancing act. There are certain things that we can do as a provider, and there are certain things that we have to do as a provider. So as a provider, you expect us to run a network that uses the best technology that we can use. So for example, when we've been talking a lot about validation, and forget about DNS. Let's talk about BGP. Let's talk about a packet of data moving from point A to point B. So there's technologies available that a lot of us are using, so that we know that that network over there is the network that we think it is, that the data is going to the right place, all that. But there's other things where it becomes a little bit more complicated. Is it our role to stop one of our clients from having a website because they haven't updated WordPress, or they haven't updated Joomla, or some other content management system? Can we take that website offline because it is unsafe? Or what can we do to encourage them to actually, update that software? If I give a server to a client, I don't know what's on the server. I mean, I don't know what they're doing. Where does that line? Where do you draw that line? I think that's the kind of thing that, that's where it's kind of, telling people, hey, you need to update this stuff. But at the same time, it's kind of interesting to look and see, okay, where do we draw that line? I mean, if I've got a server that is spewing gigabits of, crap traffic, I'm going to block it. I'm sorry. I mean, that's not open for debate or discussion. But if it's just, Joe forgot to update his WordPress install and maybe there might be a problem in the future, should I take it offline? Probably not.
Thank you, Michele. Angela, you want to add?
I'd say this again, that it still goes to the question of trust. Who do you really trust at the end of the day? If it's your ISP who will maintain on the DNS security on their side to, get you the correct data from the authoritative name servers, then why do you really have a reason to hide your information from them? That again is personal to you. If you're also going to go with DOH or DOT as well, integrity becomes a question as well. Now you only have confidentiality. Do you want to say, are you really sure that the data that you are getting is not altered anyway? The data is encrypted, yes, but there could be possibilities that it would be altered during the way someone could, decrypt that data. There's so many possibilities that could happen during transit. So it really boils down to trust of the individual. That's my perspective of the issue. Yeah.
Who do you trust? Thank you, Angela. Joe.
So I think those are both excellent sort of perspectives. And I think I'll add a third one, because none of these things completely align. They're all different, and they all have different pressures and different tensions. So the one we haven't really talked about is the one of the enterprise or the university network administrator, and how do they protect the network? How do they make sure that the network is available to their end users and can be used to access the internet? And Michele mentioned once before that you can't simply just buy a firewall and plug it in and think you're protected. And I think an important aspect of that is that the main threat from an enterprise network administrator is no longer really from the internet directly. The firewall is not giving you the protection you need for most of your threats. The firewall's function today is mainly identifying the devices within your network that are already compromised. So the threats, when you look around an office, you might look at a desktop and think, well, perhaps someone's trying to exploit some flaw on this Windows machine from the internet. That's not the vulnerability you need to look at. You need to be looking at your IP phones. You need to be looking at the printers. Now, who upgrades printers? Nobody upgrades printers. Who changes the password on a printer when they buy it and plug it into their Wi-Fi? Nobody does. Those things are just ticking time bombs. Those things are almost guaranteed that everybody who has a printer that they've not updated on the network, the printer is being controlled by somebody else. And the means by which these things get in are not directly through the firewall. They're through supported services like email, where you have users who are not technical, who open something that looks like a Word document, and it's not a Word document, or it looks like a PDF, and it's not a PDF. I get 1,000 of these things per day, and those are just the things that are not blocked by all the layers of spam protection that I have. So the threat from your enterprise network is from the software that you don't know that you're running on the devices that you've bought, on your printers, on your phones, on your laptops. And the number one purpose for this firewall today is stopping these things from calling out to the internet to get instructions for who they should attack next. The mechanism by which these firewalls do that is overwhelmingly the DNS. You block things like algorithmically generated domain names in your firewall. You stop those things resolving. You don't pass that DNS traffic out to the internet. You block it. And there's no shortage of reputation feeds that will tell you this domain, don't ever let someone resolve a name in this domain because that's hostile. That has no good benefit to anybody. That is only going to cause damage to somebody. So that control point in an enterprise network is what's threatened by DOH and DOT. DOT, you can kind of at least tell that it's happening. And if you think it's a threat, you can block it. DOH, as we've discussed, you can't. It's mixed in with all the web traffic that is really the reason for you having a network in the first place. You block that, you may as well not have a network. So I think this is the threat to the enterprise network. And it's not that it's impossible to block this stuff, because you can strip the SSL, the TLS protection at your border. The trouble is, it just becomes a lot more expensive. You used to be able to buy quite a small device. You could have a Raspberry Pi that would do this, like a $38 computer that would do this for you.
But now you can't do that anymore. Now you actually have to have the performance that allows you to strip the security, inspect the contents, and then re-encrypt so that the outside world still sees the TLS traffic that it was expecting. So you never get anything for nothing. Anybody who's trying to sell you something for nothing is making money in a way that you just don't understand yet. And DOH and DOT is giving you privacy, but at a cost, because nothing is free. So I think, just to add the third perspective, if you are the manager of a network and you have a responsibility for trying to keep your network as clean as you can, understanding that it will never be completely clean, your costs are going to go up. You're going to need bigger firewalls. You're going to need to buy products that can do things that you didn't previously have to do. And this is just the cost of that end user privacy, because you don't get anything for nothing.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think that's a very good place to end the discussion. I think the panel deserves a round of applause. I think that was a very interesting discussion. So we hope you found the session informative. Thank you very much as well. I think yourselves, you deserve a round of applause for being on time at least and staying on. And I'd like now to hand back to our host. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Sorry, my voice is a bit hoarse this morning. Thank you very much, panelist. Alice, if you look at my panel, what do you think?
Only one woman and quite an interesting panel.
Say it. She complained very loudly yesterday that there was no woman, and there she is.
Yes, it's good to see a woman and a techie woman. So well done.
You see that? Thank you so much. I have a couple of announcements to make. A lot of delegates are seated at the back, and there are spaces between us here. And sometimes I hear that people don't have headsets, and sometimes they want to ask questions. There are no microphones. I would urge you that as we come back from tea break, we come closer so that we fill up the seats here. We can't do wireless microphones because we have to talk to this microphone so that the interpreters can also be part of the conversation. I would like to take this moment to thank as well our sponsors for this event. And in no particular order, I have our Ministry for Transport and Communications. They, as the name suggests, they sponsored this event by offering transport dedicated to this conference. Thank you. I also have Bofinet, that is Botswana Fiber Networks, and Nashua. They are the ones that are sponsoring us with connectivity that we've had since the start of this event. May we please a hand? Thank you. And for those of you that are planning to have an evening elsewhere, I would like you to sort of maybe move your date to tomorrow. We have a third sponsor, that is Mascom. They have sponsored us for gala dinner, and it's going to be here tonight in this very room. So let us applaud Mascom. Thank you very much.